Welcome to our Mary Greeley Primetime Alive program, Healthy Aging, Keeping Your Body Young and Your Mind Sharp. I'm Vicki Newell. I manage the Primetime Alive program here at Mary Greeley Medical Center. Just a side note about your handout. Dr. Mitra did a couple things to condense a few of her slides after I'd printed most of the handouts. So some people's handouts might have a couple more sentences on them, others may not. You guys all have the information that's going to be covered today. So just if you're wondering why yours might be a little different. Just a reminder, if you would like to join Primetime Alive or sign up for a program, you can always go to mgmc.org/PTA. Our presenter today is Dr. Tricia Mitra. Dr. Mitra graduated with a bachelor's degree in social anthropology at the University of Sydney in Australia, and then worked for 3 years in corporate training in linguistics in Mumbai, India. She moved to San Mateo, California in the Bay Area, where she lived for 10 years. During that time, she stayed home with her 2 children before starting her own business as a birth doula, assisting families through labor and childbirth in a non-medical capacity. In 2012, she went back to school for a health sciences post-baccalaureate and then moved her family to attend Des Moines University for medical school. She completed a family medicine residency at Broadlawns Medical Center and joined McFarland Clinic in 2022. She worked initially as a hospitalist before transitioning into her current role as a family physician at McFarland Clinic Family Medicine East. Please welcome Dr. Mitra.
Uh-oh. There we go. Thank you, first of all, so much, everyone, for having me come. I'm so honored to have this opportunity to speak to all of you today. And I'm so excited to see such a great turnout for people who are interested in learning more about what I have to say. A little bit more about me. I actually grew up in Alaska. I circled the island that I'm from, Kodiak, on the map there for you. Spent the first half of my childhood there before moving to Oregon. You know the rest of my bio in terms of my professional path, but I thought you might be interested in a few other things just like that I like to do on my spare time. I have a garden of which I also like to cook, and I enjoy being outside, hiking, being really active, camping, those kinds of things, and so that's what the picture in the middle is for. There's also a picture of my lovely children. My daughter is a freshman at the University of Iowa, and my son is a junior in high school down at Roosevelt High School in Des Moines. I'm also a swimmer. I was a competitive swimmer early in my youth and then gave it up for many, many years. I was swimming for the last 2 or 3 years just on my own, and in June decided to become competitive again. And I participated in the Masters National Swim Competition last June, which was really a lot of fun. So I don't have any financial disclosures to tell you about, but I do have a personal interest in lifestyle medicine. So that is essentially the focus of what I will be talking with you about today. Our objective is to define aging and also what it means to age well. We're going to have some conversations about dementia and Alzheimer's disease, osteoporosis and bone health, heart health, and a few other things along the way. There are so many topics that we could have covered within this general broad topic as well, and each one of these alone could have been its own lecture. So I've done my best to make a nice flow for you and to give you a really good sense of what current studies are showing. We're going to talk about the lifestyle steps to living to 100 and being healthy until we're 99 3/4. All right. So first off, what exactly is aging and what is being healthy? So technically defined, aging is that time-related decline from birth until death with physiological function necessary for survival and fertility. So as our lifespans have grown older, obviously, we are now living much, much, much beyond fertility. And so aging processes have accelerated in terms of their importance in how we are living. There are indeed genetic components, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, that, we think predetermine our lifespan characteristics, and, however, we do have more ability to modulate that through diet than we used to think. So that's good news. Aging well is about having high physical, psychological, and social functioning without major disease later in life. And positive aging has essentially 5 independent factors: health, cognition, activity, affect, and physical fitness. So common health concerns for aging populations: heart failure and heart disease, decreased libido and sexual function, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, stroke, arthritis, osteoporosis, kidney disease, declining immune function, also increased rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. The list really could go on. So like I said, there's a lot we could have potentially covered today. Those items in bold are the ones that we're going to primarily focus on. So let's dive right in then with heart health. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death of both men and women and those people over 100 years old, not just in the United States, but worldwide. So it really has a big impact in our communities. It's primarily related to atherosclerosis, which is the accumulation of fatty deposits made up primarily of cholesterol, fat, and other substances that form plaques on the inside of the blood vessels and the inner arterial walls. This has several consequences in our body. It narrows our arteries. Our arteries provide nutrients and oxygen to all of our organs in the body. And so when they get clogged up and narrowed with accumulation of fatty deposits, that decreases the amount of blood that can flow to the organs for which it's supplying its oxygen and nutrients. It also leads to hardening of those arteries, which means that those arteries have decreased ability to expand and relax. And this is really key when those organs have points in time where they need increased blood flow. So maybe during exercise, for example, we actually want our arteries to dilate or enlarge to increase the amount of blood that is being supplied to those organs so that we can continue the activity we're participating in. Some examples of when that doesn't function well in terms of a heart standpoint: angina is that pain that you get when exercising related to decreased blood flow to the heart, and a type 2 NSTEMI is when damage to the heart has occurred. Plaques and inflammation also damage the endothelial cells of those vessels. Those endothelial cells are the innermost lining of the blood vessels, and when those get damaged, then it leads to the blood clotting cascade in the blood. And so occasionally from that, then we get blood clots within those vessels. And that's when we see type 1 NSTEMIs versus STEMIs, so more kinds of heart attacks. Now, all of this is primarily related to cholesterol, but LDL is unequivocally, so that low-density lipoprotein, that's LDL, that's unequivocally the number 1 killer or cause of heart disease. And LDL is found in our diet in saturated fats, trans fats, and cholesterol in our food. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when you go to the doctor and you get your cholesterol checked and you're told, oh, your levels are normal. We would think that's great, right? And for the most part, it can be. However, we take our normalized levels and compare them to the averages within the community, but those are still levels that promote disease over time. And this is shown in the studies where we can see that the level at which we find the LDL and there's no progression of heart disease, so no progression of atherosclerosis in the arteries. So if our LDL level is 60 or less, then we would not have any progression of disease. Okay, so maybe our normal LDL levels should be considered if they're 60 or less. If we don't consume any cholesterol in the diet, our body makes cholesterol, so we don't actually need to eat any in order to perform our bodily functions for which we require cholesterol. So if we eliminate it completely from our diet, because we make LDL, our body's natural levels will fall somewhere between 30 and 70. Now, if we look back at that number I just talked about what is that threshold or that level for which we start to see the accumulation of atherosclerotic disease, that's around 50 or 60 or below 60, essentially. So our bodies essentially would not produce significantly higher levels of LDL that would then go on to lead to heart disease. So it does turn out that it's possible to reverse cardiovascular disease by significantly lowering our LDL levels when done in combination with other healthy lifestyle factors. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do to lower LDL. And really, the only way to do that is to significantly reduce those foods in the diet that contain LDL or cholesterol. I already talked about what those are. So trans fats, saturated fats, and food cholesterol found within foods. Fortunately, we used to add trans fats to a lot of our processed foods. And fortunately, that's now been removed from processed foods and is no longer legal. But we do still find trans fats in natural food sources like meat and dairy. We should significantly or completely eliminate saturated fats, which is also mainly found in animal products as well as junk food. Our number one source of saturated fat in the American diet comes from pizza. Okay. But then chicken. And I think that's kind of surprising for people because a lot of people tell me that they're avoiding beef and instead they're eating chicken. So our number two source of saturated fat in the diet is chicken. Pastries, porks, and burgers. Also, I want to note that saturated fat is found in some plant foods, and that's primarily in coconut oil, palm oil, and palm kernel oil. We see a lot of palm and palm kernel oil also in processed foods, so make sure you're starting to pay attention to your food labels. Dietary cholesterol, however, is exclusively found in animal-derived foods. Eggs happens to be our number one source. Then chicken, again, beef, dairy, and pork. So I kind of already alluded to this just a little bit, but in our diet, if we are swapping chicken for beef or fish even though fish has significantly lower levels of cholesterol, the APPROACH trial showed us that those swaps did not significantly have an impact in our overall LDL levels. So the National Academies, based on this information, recommends that trans fats and dietary cholesterol consumption be as low as possible. In reality, there's no safe consumption for our cholesterol. Anything above 0 in our diet does contribute to accumulation of LDL and cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. Let's talk a little bit, though, about an additional added benefit of lowering our LDL levels. Our blood vessels are all over our body. They don't just stay in our heart. And so the presence of atherosclerotic vascular disease also has an impact in both male and female sexual function. Yes, this affects women too, even though we don't talk about that as much. The same LDL levels lead to clogged vessels in the heart and in all of our blood vessels, and that includes those of the genitalia. And in fact, 4 out of 5 men with ED have a vascular origin of that or cause from that, resulting in decreased blood flow. So is there something we can do about that? It would be really nice if there was, and in fact there are. So each additional daily serving of fruits or vegetables can reduce the risk of erectile tissue dysfunction by 10%. Okay? It's called the veggie Viagra effect. It's actually because those foods have increased nitrates, which are then used by the body to turn into nitrous oxide. Remember earlier when I talked about how it's important for our blood vessels to be able to open and dilate to increase blood flow to various parts of the body? That's essentially what the nitrites in those foods do for us. They go in, our body makes nitrous oxides and allows those blood vessels to expand. Okay? So there are some foods that are naturally rich in nitrates. Those include arugula, rhubarb, cilantro, butterleaf lettuce, spring greens, the musclin mix, if you've seen that in the store, basil, beet greens, oak leaf, Swiss chard, and beets. This also has the added benefit of lowering blood pressure because we're dilating, we're opening up those blood vessels. However, I do want to note that we kind of have an opposite effect when we consume these foods in the presence of saturated fats, because that actually leads to nitrosamine formation. Nitrosamine formation occurs with combination, and that's actually why if you've heard of hot dogs being high in nitrates and why that's unhealthy, and it has a carcinogenic effect. So be cautious, when you're combining high nitrate foods with saturated fats. So some other recommendations, we want to preserve those endothelial progenitor cells. Now, I talked about what those endothelial cells were before. That's the innermost lining of the blood vessels. The progenitor cells are those cells that go in and clean up if any of those endothelial cells are damaged. So if we have a hole in the blood vessel, for example, those progenitor cells come in and help us heal. Those holes, as I already mentioned, increase our risk for, thrombotic and thromboembolic events, meaning blood clots or blood clots that, move through the vascular system. So higher levels of progenitor cells will help reduce those risks. So there are some things we can do in our lifestyle and diet to help increase the amounts of progenitor cells that we have, such as avoiding secondhand smoke, getting regular aerobic exercise, diets low in trans fats, saturated fats, and cholesterol, as well as being high in berries, onions, and green tea. So I'm not here to say that if you have high cholesterol levels, you should do all of these things and not take the statins that your doctor is recommending. Okay, if you need statins, you need them and you should take them. But I think it's helpful to understand that there are a lot of things that we have a lot more impact in our health outcomes than we used to think. So let's move on now and talk about cognitive health. Another caveat here, there are a few reversible forms of dementia. And so if you or a loved one, you have any concerns about this for yourself or for them, please make sure you speak to your doctor. Let's define dementia as chronic disease that leads to a decline in cognitive function to the point that it impacts functional ability. Okay, so we all may have moments where we are worried about having increased forgetfulness, or can't find a word or can't think of a word. So loss of language, problem-solving ability, decreased reasoning. It's not until those become significant or severe enough, though, that they impact function that we start thinking about dementia. It is one of our fastest growing epidemics, affecting millions of people. Millions of people, 10 people, affecting 1 in 10, so 10% of people over age 65 and 45% of people over age 85. It's also one of those diseases that adds a huge amount of burden, not just for the person suffering from the disease or the illness, but also for the family members taking care of them. So there are several types of dementia. We're actually just going to focus on the 2 number 1 causes here today. Alzheimer's is the most common type, and vascular dementia is the second most common. I'd like to take a moment, though, and talk about this very special woman here. There was an autopsy report done on a 115-year-old woman. At the time of her death, she was the oldest person in the world. She died of stomach cancer. And that autopsy in her brain showed that she had no evidence of disease. Her cognitive function and performance at age 113 was above average for nearly half her age. So maybe this raises a little bit of a question in, is cognitive decline, a necessary part of aging? So Alzheimer's disease, classically thought as an accumulation of plaques in the brain made out of amyloid. However, recent autopsies have also shown that Alzheimer's patients have significant buildup of atherosclerotic plaques in the brain, most concentrated in the memory centers. So here's that atherosclerosis again. The Alzheimer's gene, also known APOE, is also the gene that encodes the main cholesterol carrier found in the brain. So we see that there is also an association between the gene that we know is linked to the development of Alzheimer's and how cholesterol is carried within the brain. I would like to note, though, and I think it's quite interesting as well, that the cholesterol levels themselves of people with Alzheimer's are not necessarily significantly more elevated than those people who don't have Alzheimer's. But what is elevated is oxidized cholesterol levels. And those can be found in higher levels even with people just with mild cognitive impairment. Oxidization happens with inflammation and free radical formation. And so there's some process or potentially some process related to inflammation that leads to that oxidization and making risk of Alzheimer's disease higher. There's a lot of movement towards reclassifying Alzheimer's disease as a vascular disease similar to cardiovascular disease. And why might that be important? If Alzheimer's disease is related to atherosclerosis and cholesterol, similarly to heart disease, then improving rates of cholesterol and lowering LDL levels could potentially prevent Alzheimer's. And there's been studies that have shown that. Dean Ornish conducted a study that showed a randomized controlled trial that had a group of people for which they were counseled to change and modify their diet and lifestyle for 20 weeks, and a group of people who didn't make any changes to their lifestyle in 20 weeks. Now, these were two different groups of people with Alzheimer's. The group that did not make any dietary changes, 70% of that group got worse in terms of their Alzheimer's symptoms, and nobody got better. However, in the control group, so the group of people that made modifications to their diet and lifestyle, 70% remained stable and some even improved. This is the only study that's ever been conducted to actually show an improvement in symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Another thing I'd like to point out, though, is back to the APOE gene. We would assume that higher penetrance, which means higher occurrences of that gene present in the community, would also be associated automatically with higher levels of Alzheimer's. Nigeria is an area in the world that actually has the highest penetrance. So again, that's the highest percentage of people within their community that carry the APOE gene, but they also have one of the lowest rates of cardiovascular disease as well as Alzheimer's in the world. And so people started looking at why that is. And what they found is that their LDL levels were very, very low, and their diets didn't have a lot of cholesterol in them. The Center for Alzheimer's Research actually wrote an article saying Alzheimer's disease is incurable but preventable. So maybe with improvement or changes in our diet and lifestyle, we could prevent millions of cases a year. Let's also talk just a little bit about the role of blood pressure and how it impacts vascular dementia, although I've already been sort of talking about Alzheimer's also potentially being a vascular form of dementia as well. The SPRINT trial was supposed to be conducted over 6 years, and it had, again, 2 different groups that were randomized to treat their blood pressure, but there were 2 different blood pressure thresholds. One was 140, so they were given medications to keep their blood pressure less than 140. That's the systolic or the top number of the blood pressure. There was another group that used medications to decrease their blood pressure to less than 120 systolic. That's actually closer to a normal blood pressure range. The study actually had to be stopped 3 years in because the group that had lower blood pressure improved so much, or rather had such benefit from that lowering of blood pressure to the point it was unethical to continue the study and deprive the control group of those added benefits. So lowering your blood pressure and taking care of your blood pressure also has an impact. And that's because high blood pressure can cause very small bleeds in the brain. And these are actually found at 3 times the frequency in people with high blood pressure, even if they've never had a stroke. And then we also sometimes on imaging find things called lacunar infarcts, which are mini strokes, and that is associated with elevated blood pressure as well as brain shrinkage. So let's talk about a few other things that might play a role. Let's not forget, again, about smoking, but also repetitive traumatic brain injuries, air pollution, and alcohol all have an impact on cognitive health. Sleep is also very, very important for our cognitive health. Sleep is when our brain seems to filter our fluid in which the brain is bathed, and that occurs at night. That ability of our brain to do that seems to decrease with age, so I think that makes sleep even more important as we get older. A single all-nighter can cause a significant increase in amyloid beta in the brain, enough to the point where it's measurable and seen on PET scans. Another association with Alzheimer's disease is something called BDNF levels. That's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which plays a protective role of the brain. Those are found in decreased levels in people with Alzheimer's. And so it's thought that it's potentially protective against its development and can slow mental decline. Higher BDNF levels seems to cut Alzheimer's development by half. So here are some recommendations. Again, reduce cholesterol, particularly LDL levels, to prevent atherosclerosis. Reduce blood pressure to close to normal levels of less than 120/80. Stop smoking or using nicotine if you are. Get adequate sleep. And boost BDNF levels, which we can do through exercise. I'd also like to mention BDNF is responsible in the brain for a sensation of health and well-being, and exercise can boost that quite a bit. So all exercise helps boost it, but higher intense exercises boost it even more. The foods, such as fruits, vegetables, nuts, turmeric, cocoa powder, rye groats, all help boost BDNF levels. And then increasing our natural as well as supplemental fiber intake. I recommend 30 to 60 grams of fiber per day, by the way. And that helps increase butyrate levels, which is produced by healthy good bacteria and has also been shown to decrease amyloid levels in the brain. Okay, bone health, all right? We'll define that as either reduced formation or excessive loss of bone. Contributes to millions of fractures every year and affects an estimated 200 million people per year. It's not genetic, okay? So, and we see that through wide variations in rates of osteoporosis through the world, which suggests that maybe it's not necessarily has to be part of our aging process as well. 85%, I'll also like to note though that 85% of our fracture risk is not actually related to decreased bone mineral density, but is instead related to the risk of falling. So let's look at what we can do to help prevent falls, okay? Our muscle loss has also been shown to decrease or increase with age as well. And so preserving muscle to improve balance can also help reduce our risk for falls. Several randomized controlled trials found that strength and balance training can cut rates almost in half. Muscle loss begins in the age of 30 and accelerates into the 50s to about 1 to 2% every year. And by 80, you have approximately 50% of the fibers in the muscles that are lost. And strength related to that can be even more dramatic. However, we can reverse that loss, but we don't do it by maintaining our protein consumption, which is what we commonly hear. Instead, we do it by using our muscles. Resistance exercises is the only method to consistently be proven to improve weakness, muscle loss, and physical function. And then just a little bit about I would like to comment a little bit about protein, and that is that we only need 0.6 to 0.8 milligrams per kilogram of body weight for all adult ages. So simple math, a 100-pound person, okay, times 4 divided by 10 would be about 40 grams of protein per day. So I recognize that's quite a small person there, but still shows that 40, maybe 50 grams a day is much lower than we are generally told. No type of protein has been shown to be better than any other type of protein at improving sarcopenia. On the slide means muscle loss. However, animal protein has been associated with inflammation, probably through a process via mTOR, and that inflammation has been associated with muscle loss. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the truth about dairy. Most meta-analyses suggest that countries with higher milk consumption had higher rates of hip fractures and mortality. There's a famous Swedish study involving over 100,000 participants that were followed over 20 years that showed milk actually increased the rates of bone fractures. Harvard followed that up with another study that was conducted over 30 years and 200,000 people that were published in 2019 that showed the same results. So U.S. National Osteoporosis Foundation, as well as the equivalent foundation in Europe, recommend dairy consumption for bone density preservation. And I'd like to just note that the studies and the material that are used in putting together those recommendations have corporate sponsorships as well as industry reports, which are allowed to be used as part of how they develop those recommendations and guidelines. Now, Canada fairly recently actually made those industry reports and removed corporate sponsorships from the committee that was putting together those guidelines, and the result of that is that they actually had changes to what they were recommending. The most notable changes were recommending an increase in plant-based food intake and removing the recommended consumption of dairy as a food group. So, some lifestyle recommendations. Vitamin D. More is not necessarily better and has actually been shown to increase fall risk. So I recommend between 1,600 and 3,200 international units a day. And calcium is best obtained from a healthy diet. It's okay if your doctor tells you to use a calcium supplement because of a condition, then please follow your doctor's instructions. But too much calcium has been also associated with increased cardiovascular risk, which is why we're no longer telling everybody they should be supplementing with calcium. Soy milk has phytoestrogens in it, and it kind of got a bad rep for people being worried about it increasing breast cancer risk and things like that. We actually know now that there are different kinds of estrogen receptors, however, and soy milk binds with those that offer bone protection and also have been shown to decrease breast cancer risk. Exercise regularly. Astronauts lose 1% of their bone mass for every month that they are in orbit. Okay, so just like your muscle, if you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, the process of strengthening your muscles that we talked about already also provides mild stress to the bone and offers some protective modalities against bone loss. So the single most important thing you can do is prevent falls. Engage in balance and functional exercises. So the next two slides, I've actually copied for you Canada's recommendation for osteoporosis management. And so I'd like to just point out here, I don't know, you can't, oh, you can. So here, balance and functional training, okay? 2 times per week to reduce fall risk, and then progressive resistance training including your abdominal and back extensor muscles. Thank you. Okay. And then the second one here is that nutritional component that I already talked about, where they recommend, increasing a plant-based diet, and then no dietary supplementation each day if through your diet you reach calcium intake of, for men, 1,000 milligrams per day, or for women, 1,200 milligrams a day. So that's where if you're getting what you need through what you're eating, you don't need to supplement. And then they recommend supplementing with vitamin D, 400 international units every day, starting at the age of 50. Also of note, there are very few vitamin D rich foods. We get vitamin D from being out in the sun. And since we are rightfully recommended to wear sunscreen, we don't actually produce as much vitamin D as we used to. So, where did some of this start? Where did this come from? Where did this importance and role of diet and lifestyle modifications for our health kind of start? And that was through, you may have heard of the blue zone. So these 5 areas across the world where it was noticed that they have, I believe, up to 10 times the average of number of centenarians, which is people who live over the age of 100. These groups, we were curious, why are there so many people who live over 100 found in these areas of the world? And so these groups were studied, and it was found that they had several things in common. And of note, those locations are Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, Saucony in Italy, Ikaria in Greece, Okinawa in Japan, and then Loma Linda, California. The similarities that they shared were social engagement, family coherence, avoiding smoking, daily exercise, but the single most important component appeared to be plant-based nutrition, which accounted for about 50% in the difference of lifespan. Okay. Successful aging has, become a very important concept to describe the quality of aging. It's a multi-dimensional concept. The main focus is how to expand functional as well as healthy years to the lifespan. So not just focusing on how do we live longer, but how do we also increase our functional and healthy years. There were 4 domains describing successful aging, and those were avoiding disease and disability, which is a lot of what we've talked about today. Also having high cognitive, mental, and physical function, which we've also talked about today, but then also being actively engaged in life and being psychologically well adapted later in life. The absence of disease and disability, I would like to point out, is not the most important element in the concept of aging successfully, and people with chronic disease can also age successfully. Adaptive, psychological, and social mechanisms can compensate for limitations in the physiological health. So, in summary, I recommend that we eat, 95 to 100% plant-based to virtually eliminate atherosclerotic disease to preserve heart and cognitive function. There are several diets that you could follow or look up online to help give you some guidelines for that. The Blue Zone diet, the Mediterranean diet, though I will comment, a lot of people add a ton of olive oil when they're trying to follow the Mediterranean diet, and also substitute a lot of fish intake. And remember, even the consumption of fish wasn't shown to lower LDL levels. So just caution with those 2 things if you decide to follow a Mediterranean diet. And then a whole foods plant-based diet, which takes it probably the furthest, which is eliminating essentially all processed foods, including oils, in addition to eliminating or reducing the animal foods. Exercise is a medicine that preserves muscle and bone health, resulting in decreased fall risks and fractures. Reducing stress, which increases food intake because of the comfort foods. Get enough good quality sleep to allow your brain to cleanse itself and reduce amyloid, and then maintain those social ties. Thank you so much.
All right. So, who has questions? There was a lot of great information there. Thank you so much. Oh, we've got one up here. And this is how I get my exercise.
How do you get a good night's sleep? I don't sleep all night.
Yeah.
And I don't know how.
That's a great question. A lot of it, so I don't necessarily always in my practice recommend daily sleep aids if they can be avoided, okay? But sometimes they can't be avoided. That being said, there are a lot of really great practices that we can do. And unfortunately, sleep is one of those things where we really have to modify probably a lot of little things in order to get the good night's sleep we need. And some of those include, that I think people haven't heard of, is using a sunlight to help regulate the circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm being that natural day rhythm that our body has. So when we wake up in the morning, sitting underneath a sunlight for however long you can tolerate, the studies were between 30 and 90 minutes. That may be a little bit too much time for some people, but if you have a cup of tea in the morning or a cup of coffee, sit underneath your sunlight for that time. That tells the body it's morning and starts that circadian rhythm process. reducing the blue light. So blue light filtering glasses that you put on in the evening can be also really helpful, but eliminating some of the media and that kind of stuff. I mean, I think we all are guilty of, sitting on the cell phones and stuff before we fall to bed anymore rather than reading a book. So those are kind of, I think, some of the common things that, I find people may need to consider when trying to get a better night's sleep. The other things, that you may have heard of is reducing caffeine intake and decreasing your water consumption. Exercising in the morning instead of the evening would be some additional recommendations.
Well, and just so you know, I have issues with insomnia, and I've worked with my doctor, and she said to me, Vicki, why don't I do a program for your group on insomnia? And I said, I would love that. So I'm working with her. So I think it'll be somewhere January, February, somewhere around in there. So we can talk some here, but know that we are going to have a program on this.
When you say it's, this light, I've been reading about a red light effect. Is this kind of what you're talking about? That I can go somewhere and it's like a sun tanning, but it's called red light.
I'm not familiar with what that is. What I am familiar with though is reducing the blue light exposures in the evenings.
The only reason I've heard of red light is we have a friend that has their own sauna, and it has red light in there, and it's supposed
for red light saunas. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
I'm not
That's all I
familiar
know.
with the research on that.
Yeah. Well, if it's on Facebook.
Thank you. The Japanese eat basically large quantities of white rice, lots of fish, very small quantities of vegetables, but a lot of pickled vegetables, hardly any fruit. So how do you explain that they can live to 100 years?
Well, it was the Okinawa group in Japan. And I don't know enough of the differences between what the rest of Japan eats and what Okinawa, Japan eats. So I don't know that I can really comment specifically on that, other than that particular group within Japan was studied and found to have these same characteristics.
And we've had, and it's probably time again, Dr. Peter Martin, who's the head of the gerontology department at Iowa State. He's done a lot of research on blue zones, so we need to have him back. So know that food is one component. The walkability and exercise, the intergenerational, the socialization, there's a lot more to it than just the diet. And I would still say that diet you talked about is much better than what us as who live in the old US, what we consume. But yeah. What other questions? Gosh, you guys have some good ideas for other programs for us to be doing.
What do you think about supplementing bone density with a shot or another product like Prolia or
medications?
Yes.
I mean, so if you have osteoporosis and you need to take a medication to help improve your bone density, then that you should have that conversation with your doctor about the potential risks for that of future fractures. So my primary focus here is how do we prevent getting to that point? So if you're there, then you should follow the recommendations of your doctor.
So you kind of gave me the impression at the start of your presentation that maybe you follow some of this.
I do.
You do. Mm-hmm. Has that been a lifelong, or is that something you've...
My journey started about 5 years, and it was as I started looking into this research, I found the information very compelling. And the journey to my own plant-based eating has been long and has ebbed and flowed over time. But I have noticed weight loss as a potential benefit, increased energy, the exercise and what I'm able to do. I think have all been benefits from following this. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
yeah.
it's not as easy. It's not as easy said it's easy to say, right? It's not necessarily always easy to do. I mean, we talked about the social implications and stuff as well as being, a part of healthy and successful aging. And some of that revolves around food and the activities and stuff that you're engaging with your community. So, this is really about what do the studies show about maybe what's the perfect way of, eating to improve our health. But it's a lot more complicated than that and is tied with, within our social network as well. And so, I tell my patients in my clinic that, my role here today is to tell you what the studies show. And, outside of that, then you have to look at, how that fits into your lifestyle and what changes, make sense and would work for you. The other thing I tell them, though, and this is what I have found to be true for myself, is that the slow addition of small changes over time really add up. And over time now, I am 95 to 100% plant-based. I don't crave meat anymore. I can now sit, in a social gathering and not feel the need to, have something. I still do occasionally, but my preferences and all of that have changed as I've continued on this journey.
So talking about another program here, do you have somebody you could recommend that could talk about transitioning to a plant-based diet that would be good?
I don't know. I'll have to give it some thought.
All right. Yeah.
Based diet, I want to know what
You want to know what it is. All right. Well, because surely there's got to be more to it than, make yourself broccoli for dinner and, right? And
I just have a question about dairy and specifically milk, because I have never been a milk drinker. I've never liked it, but I noticed that it just says soy milk. What about the plant-based milk, like almond or oat milk?
Those would be fine. Natural. So a lot of the non-dairy milks may be supplemented with calcium, and so that would maybe be similar to calcium supplementation, but it's still in the context of what you're eating, and it doesn't have the context of the inflammatory response that dairy milk would have, which is thought to be part of why the rates of bone fractures and osteoporosis are higher in dairy-consuming areas of the world. Other foods, though, have a ton of calcium: leafy greens, beans, whole grains, all of those. So if you're following a plant-based diet and as part of that really eating a wide variety of foods, then you should be easily getting the amount of calcium that you need.
I didn't see many comments about fish, either pro or con. The only thing I saw was on your meat and protein food chart for cholesterol that it had shrimp and squid at 212, just like eggs, and you talked about eggs not being good. So in general, your comments on fish?
Yeah. Well, so the ones that I had on there were those were the categories of food that contributed the most. So shrimp and squid consumption is probably just not high enough to be on that list of what contributes. But you're correct. The handout that I brought has tables of average amounts of cholesterol found in different categories of food. And I separated out the fish and the squid and the shrimp to show you that there's such a huge variety in how much cholesterol these things contain. Fish, 3.5 ounces, I believe, is 44 milligrams of cholesterol on there. And then the squid and the shrimp is 212, and one egg has 212.
all right, we have a couple questions online, so Tim will read those for us.
Is there any protective effect of having a high level of HDL cholesterol? And a related question, what is the significance of the HDL cholesterol ratio?
Yeah. So HDL does offer protection, but in general, still the lower the cholesterol, the better. So we do tend to see that 1-to-1 ratio of HDL to LDL offering some protection, but I would still recommend people work on lowering their LDL as much as possible.
And then that covered the ratio as well, because you were saying the 1-to-1. All right. Any other questions?
Some people, I'll take that just a little bit further, actually. Some people commonly ask me, what can we do to raise HDL levels? And so we talked a lot today about how to lower those LDL levels, but we can raise LDL levels through exercise.
Raise HDL.
Excuse me. Yes, thank you. We can raise our protective cholesterol, the HDL, through plant-based eating, not surprisingly, but also exercise.
I didn't want anybody to say, Dr. Mitra told me if I exercised, I'd raise my LDL, so that's why I'm not exercising.
I'm in another program. Oh, sorry. I'm in another program through Mary Greeley. It's called Keys to Unlocking. Oh, I can't remember it, but it's dementia program. I just want to make a comment. When you say whole plant-based, you're also including that you eat like beans and edamame and
Yep.
yeah. Okay.
So whole foods, the last diet I mentioned on there, the whole foods plant-based. So, you can eat a plant-based diet that, has bread, flour in it, and that's still a plant food. It's just got some additional processing to grind up that flour to make it into bread. A whole foods diet focuses more on the foods as close to how they are when they come out of the ground. So rather than eating white rice, which has the processing to remove that external layer to it, they would eat brown rice instead. So you're eating the whole part of the rice. So instead of having oatmeal, which is, parts of it removed and then is flattened, they would eat oat groats, which is then the whole kernel of oat.
All right. Any other questions? Oh, here we go.
When you do a blood lipid panel, there's something called a VLDL. Where does that fit into this conversation?
I didn't look up the VLDL, related to how this is, so I don't know that I'm going to comment any further on that.
And that's very low.
Very low, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Density lipoprotein.
So HDL, high density lipoprotein, LDL, low density lipoprotein. The HDL carries the LDL, and that's why high density means bigger, low density is smaller. So the very low would be even smaller, so stickier.
So it's the HDL that carries the LDL.
Which is carries the LDL out of the body. Yeah, transports it in the body.
We're supposed to eat yogurt for our gut bacteria. Do you recommend no yogurt whatsoever?
So there are all kinds of healthy microbes all over the vegetables and the fruits that we're eating. And so that is actually an excellent source of probiotics outside of yogurt. The other thing that we do when we eat a whole foods plant-based diet that avoids dairy products is the amount of fiber that's found within those foods, and the diversity of fiber that we're eating feeds the healthy bacteria that we find within our own microbiota. So not only are we then taking in the bacteria found on the fruits and vegetables as probiotics, but then we're also feeding them through the digestive system. So increasing your fiber intake is a better way to improve the microbiota within your GI system.
I'm learning a whole lot today. This is very good. Very good. Any other questions before we... Well, Dr. Mitra, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and all the great information. So
thank you
wonderful.
For having me.
All right. So those of you who are here in person, please fill out your evaluation. Give us ideas for other programs, other presenters that you would like to have. And then our next program is next Thursday. Kind of related to this, Dr. Kitchell, who's a retired neurologist, has a vested interest in preventing frailty. And that just because we age, we do not have to become frail, which then again, we talk about falls and such. So if you know Dr. Kitchell, you know he's very passionate about preventing falls. So next Thursday, November 7th, back in here, 2 p.m. Hope you can join us. And be dry. I did peek my nose outside. It was raining pretty hard a little bit ago. So stay dry, stay safe, and thank you for coming out, everyone.